The scorching Zanzibar sun beat down mercilessly on the corrugated iron roof of the small recording studio, its heat creating waves that shimmered like mirages above the dusty streets of Stone Town. Inside, 17-year-old Farrokh Bulsara stood frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs as the words he had just heard echoed in his mind like a death sentence. The visiting record executive from London, a man whose opinion could make or break careers across the Indian Ocean, had just delivered his verdict with the casual cruelty of someone who had crushed dreams before breakfast. "You'll never sing professionally with those teeth." The executive's eyes had lingered on Farrokh's prominent overbite, counting the 4 extra incisors that crowded his upper jaw like unwanted guests at a dinner party. These teeth had been the source of relentless teasing throughout his childhood at boarding school in India, earning him nicknames that stung worse than any physical blow. Now standing in this makeshift studio where local musicians came to chase their impossible dreams, those same teeth threatened to end his musical aspirations before they had truly begun. The executive leaned back in his chair, his crisp white shirt somehow still immaculate despite the oppressive heat. His suggestion came wrapped in the tone of someone offering helpful advice rather than delivering a crushing blow. Corrective surgery, he explained matter-of-factly, was the only solution. A simple procedure could realign those troublesome teeth, reshape that distinctive jawline, and perhaps there might be a future in music for the young man standing before him. Farrokh's parents, Bomi and Jayabul Sara, had always taught their son to respect authority, to listen to those with experience and wisdom. His father worked diligently for the British Colonial Office, embodying the values of hard work and conformity that had served their Parsi family well through generations of migration and adaptation. They had sacrificed enormously to give their son opportunities they never had, sending him to prestigious boarding schools despite their modest means, nurturing his obvious musical talents with piano lessons and encouragement. But as Farrokh stood there, feeling the weight of expectation and the crushing force of professional rejection, something deep within him began to stir. It was not defiance exactly, nor was it mere stubborn pride. Instead, it was something far more profound, an instinctive understanding that the very thing being criticized might actually be the key to his uniqueness. The teeth that had caused him years of self-consciousness, the overbite that made him cover his mouth when he laughed, the distinctive jaw structure that set him apart from his peers. What if these weren't flaws to be corrected, but gifts to be embraced? The silence in the room stretched like a rubber band pulled to its breaking point. The executive waited for the obvious response, the grateful acceptance of his expert advice. After all, countless aspiring performers had undergone similar procedures to conform to industry standards. The music business, even more than most industries, demanded a certain look, a particular aesthetic that would translate well to photographs and television appearances. Farrokh's mind raced through the implications of the choice before him. Surgery would mean months of recovery, significant expense his family could ill afford, and the permanent alteration of features that, despite their unconventional nature, were fundamentally his own. But more than the practical considerations, something deeper rebelled against the suggestion. If he changed his teeth, would he still be himself? Would the voice that emerged from his transformed mouth still carry the same power, the same distinctive quality that had drawn him to music in the first place? The young man had always been acutely aware of his teeth, certainly, but he had also noticed something else. The unique resonance they created when he sang. The extra space in his mouth, the distinctive shape of his palate, The way his breath moved differently because of his unusual dental structure. All of these factors contributed to a sound that was unlike anything he had heard from other singers. Where others might see deformity, he had begun to sense possibility. Standing in that sweltering studio, with the smell of dust and ambition heavy in the air, Farrokh Bulsara made a choice that would echo through the corridors of music history. He looked the executive directly in the eyes, those same eyes that had so casually dismissed his dreams, and spoke with a quiet determination that surprised even himself. He would not be having surgery. He would not be changing his teeth. Instead, he would find a way to make his supposed disadvantage into his greatest strength. The executive's expression shifted from professional patience to barely concealed irritation. He had seen stubborn young performers before, kids who thought they knew better than industry professionals with decades of experience. Most of them, he knew, would eventually come crawling back, ready to conform once reality had knocked some sense into them. He shrugged, gathered his papers, and prepared to move on to the next hopeful candidate. Farrokh Bulsara, he was certain, would fade into the obscurity that awaited all those too proud to accept good advice. But as the door closed behind the departing executive, Farrokh felt not defeat, but liberation. For the first time in his young life, he had chosen authenticity over acceptance, had bet on himself rather than on the approval of others. The path ahead would be more difficult, certainly, but it would be entirely his own. He had no way of knowing that this single moment of defiance would eventually revolutionize not just his own life, but the very sound of rock and roll itself. The decision made in that humble Zanzibar studio would prove to be the foundation upon which one of music's most legendary careers would be built. Those teeth, those supposedly career-ending teeth, would become the instrument through which some of the most powerful and distinctive vocals in popular music would emerge. The young man who refused to conform would become the artist who taught the world that our differences are not obstacles to overcome, but superpowers to embrace. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the cramped recording studio office, casting harsh shadows across the mahogany desk, where a middle-aged executive shuffled through headshot photographs. Behind the desk, gold records caught the artificial light, testament to careers launched and dreams realized. But for 17-year-old Farrokh Bulsara, standing awkwardly in his best shirt and pressed trousers, this sterile room felt more like a courtroom than a gateway to stardom. The executive barely looked up from his papers as he delivered his verdict with the casual cruelty that comes from years of crushing aspirations. Those protruding front teeth, he declared with a dismissive wave, would make a singing career impossible. The overbite was too pronounced, too distracting. Audiences would focus on the dental irregularity rather than the music. His advice was blunt and final: fix the teeth, or forget about performing professionally. Young Farrokh stood frozen, feeling the weight of that pronouncement settle into his chest like lead. The extra incisors that had marked him as different since childhood, that had drawn stares and whispers in school corridors, were now being branded as career-ending obstacles. The executive was already reaching for the next file, the interview clearly over, when something unexpected happened. Instead of shrinking away in defeat, instead of nodding in resignation and shuffling toward the door, Farrokh felt a spark of defiance ignite somewhere deep within his core. Walking home through the dusty streets of Stone Town, the executive's words echoed in his mind, but so did something else. His mother's voice, gentle but firm, from countless conversations over the years. God made you exactly as you should be. Bulsara had repeated this phrase whenever her son came home upset about playground taunts or self-conscious about his appearance. She would hold his face in her hands and speak with the certainty of someone who had crossed continents and cultures, who understood that difference could be strength disguised as weakness. That evening, in the privacy of his small bedroom, Farrokh stood before the mirror with new eyes. He had always tried to hide the pronounced overbite, speaking with lips partially closed, smiling with his mouth shut. But now, examining his reflection with scientific curiosity rather than shame, he noticed something the executive had missed entirely. The unusual dental structure created unique spaces within his mouth, forming what appeared to be natural resonance chambers. When he hummed softly, the sounds seemed to bounce and amplify in ways he had never paid attention to before. The decision crystallized slowly, like a photograph developing in a dark room. While his friends urged him to see a dentist, while well-meaning relatives suggested surgery would open doors, Farrokh made a choice that would ripple through music history. He would not alter his anatomy to fit someone else's vision of acceptability. Instead, he would discover what his unique structure could accomplish when embraced rather than hidden. This was not mere stubbornness or teenage rebellion. This was the recognition of a fundamental truth that would define everything that followed. The very feature that made him different, that made others uncomfortable, that prompted cruel comments and rejection letters, might be the key to something unprecedented. In that moment of defiant self-acceptance, Farrokh Bulsara began the transformation into an artist who would redefine the possibilities of human voice itself. The young man who walked into that recording studio had been seeking permission to be a singer. The one who walked out had decided to become something the industry had never seen before. He would take those extra teeth, that pronounced overbite, that unusual oral architecture, and forge them into an instrument capable of magic. The executive had told him what he couldn't do. Farrokh would spend the rest of his life proving him wrong, one impossible note at a time. In his bedroom that night, as Stonetown settled into evening quiet, he began to experiment. Tentatively at first, then with growing confidence, he explored the unique acoustics of his own mouth. Each hum, each vocalization revealed new possibilities. The teeth that had been labeled a flaw were actually precision instruments, creating chambers and resonances that a conventional mouth could never produce. This was not just about refusing surgery or accepting his appearance. This was about recognizing that nature had given him something rare and powerful, disguised as an imperfection. The record executive had seen only what was different. Farrokh was beginning to see what was possible. Years later, when that 4-octave range would mesmerize audiences across the globe, when those distinctive teeth would become part of rock and roll iconography, when his refusal to conform would inspire millions to embrace their own uniqueness, the wisdom of that teenage decision would become clear. But in that moment, in that small room in Zanzibar, it was simply a young man choosing to believe his mother over a stranger, choosing possibility over convention, choosing to see a gift where others saw only a flaw. The fluorescent lights in the recording studio had revealed what the executive considered a career-ending defect. The gentle lamplight in Farrokh's bedroom illuminated something entirely different. The birth of a legend who would prove that the most extraordinary music often comes from the most unconventional instruments. His voice, shaped by those protruding teeth and unique oral structure, would eventually span 4 octaves and move mountains. The decision was made. The journey toward becoming Freddie Mercury had begun. The scent of frangipani blossoms drifted through the humid Zanzibar air as 17-year-old Farrokh Bulsara stood outside the weathered blue door of Mrs. Khatri's music studio. His heart hammered against his ribs, each beat echoing the cruel words that had haunted him for weeks. "You'll never sing with those teeth." The record executive's dismissal still burned in his memory, but today would be different. Today, he would find someone who saw possibility where others saw only flaws. Mrs. Kamala Khatri was known throughout Stone Town as an enigma. While other vocal coaches followed traditional British methods inherited from colonial times, she drew from Indian classical techniques, Arabic maqam scales, and African rhythmic traditions that pulsed through Zanzibar's multicultural heart. Students whispered that she could hear potential in the most unlikely voices, that she taught singers to embrace their uniqueness rather than conform to European standards. The door creaked open before Farrokh could knock. Mrs. Khatri stood before him, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a simple bun, and eyes that seemed to pierce straight through pretense. Her studio was a cramped room filled with instruments from around the world, a harmonium from India, drums from mainland Africa, a piano that had seen better decades, and walls covered with photographs of students who had found their voices within these walls. She gestured for him to sit on a worn cushion while she settled cross-legged on another. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the distant call of vendors in the marketplace outside. Finally, she spoke in accented English, her voice carrying the melodic inflections of someone who thought in multiple languages. "Tell me why you're here, but more importantly, tell me why you believe you shouldn't be." The words tumbled out of Farrokh then, the entire story of his meeting with the record executive, the mockery of his protruding teeth, the suggestion that he get surgery if he ever wanted to be taken seriously as a performer. He spoke of his extra incisors, the way his upper jaw extended forward, creating what dentists called a severe overbite and what cruel classmates had nicknamed his rabbit teeth. Mrs. Khatri listened without interruption, her dark eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, studying him with the intensity of someone reading sheet music. "Open your mouth," she said simply. Farrokh hesitated. This was always the moment of judgment, when people saw the dental formation that made him self-conscious, that made him cover his smile with his hand, that had apparently disqualified him from a music career before it even began. But something in Mrs. Khatri's manner was different from the executive's clinical assessment. She wasn't looking for flaws to fix. She was searching for something else entirely. He opened his mouth wide, feeling exposed and vulnerable. Mrs. Khatri leaned forward, not with the disgust he expected, but with fascination. She asked him to sing a simple scale, to hold different vowel sounds, to let his voice resonate in ways that felt natural. As he sang, she placed her hand near his throat, feeling the vibrations, then moved it to his chest, his back, mapping the path his voice took through his body. "Remarkable," she murmured, almost to herself. "Do you understand what you have here?" Farrokh shook his head, confused by her apparent excitement about what others had called a deformity. Mrs. Khatri rose and moved to a small blackboard covered with musical notations. She began sketching the human vocal tract, explaining how sound was produced, how resonance worked, how the shape of the mouth and throat affected tone and timbre. "Your additional teeth, your forward jaw position," she said, pointing to different parts of her diagram. "They create extra resonating spaces that most singers don't possess. It's like having additional chambers in a musical instrument." She pulled out a small mirror and had him watch as she demonstrated different tongue positions and breathing techniques. Most Western vocal training, she explained, focused on controlling and standardizing the voice, making it fit predetermined ideals of beauty and acceptability. But the greatest singers throughout history were those who learned to exploit their unique physical characteristics, who turned their supposed limitations into their greatest strengths. Think of Kulthum, the legendary Egyptian singer whose throaty vibrato could move audiences to tears across the Arab world. Consider the Indian classical masters who spent lifetimes learning to use every subtle variation in their vocal apparatus to express emotions words couldn't capture. Your teeth, your jaw structure, they're not obstacles to overcome. They're instruments waiting to be played. Mrs. Khatri had Farrokh place his hand on his chest and hum at different pitches, feeling how the vibrations changed as he adjusted his mouth position. She taught him to think of his extra dental space not as empty area to be minimized, but as acoustic chambers that could be shaped and molded to create sounds other singers couldn't achieve. The first exercise she gave him seemed almost absurd. She had him purse his lips and create different sized openings while sustaining notes, demonstrating how the shape of the mouth opening affected resonance and overtones. Then she had him experiment with his tongue position, showing him how the large space behind his prominent teeth could be used to create a secondary resonating chamber. As they worked together that first afternoon, something extraordinary began to happen. When Farrokh followed her instructions, when he stopped trying to hide his dental structure and instead learned to use it purposefully, his voice took on qualities he'd never heard from himself before. There were rich harmonics in his lower register, crystalline clarity in his upper notes, and something indefinable that seemed to give his voice more presence, more power than its volume alone should have carried. Mrs. Khatri smiled as she heard these new sounds emerging from her student. She explained that many of the world's most distinctive voices belonged to singers who had learned to work with, rather than against, their physical uniqueness. She spoke of how Billie Holiday's damaged vocal cords gave her voice its haunting quality, how Louis Armstrong's gravelly tone came from techniques that would have horrified classical teachers but moved millions of listeners. "Your voice will never sound like anyone else's," she told Farrokh as their first lesson drew to a close. "That's not a limitation, that's your greatest gift." As the sun began to set over Stone Town, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the Indian Ocean, Farrokh walked home with a lightness in his step that had been absent for weeks. The same teeth that had been pronounced a career-ending flaw just days before now felt like a secret weapon, a unique advantage that no other singer possessed. Mrs. Khatri had given him more than vocal exercises. She had given him a new way of understanding himself and his place in the musical world. That night, as he practiced the breathing techniques she had taught him, Farrokh began to envision a future where his distinctive appearance wasn't something to overcome, but something to celebrate. He imagined audiences captivated not despite his unconventional look, but because of the extraordinary sounds that unconventional structure could produce. For the first time since that crushing meeting with the record executive, he allowed himself to dream of stages and spotlights, of crowds singing along to melodies that could only have come from his unique voice. The boy who had entered Mrs. Khatri's studio that afternoon, carrying shame about his appearance, walked out with the first seeds of understanding that would eventually bloom into one of rock music's most iconic and unmistakable voices. He didn't know it yet, but he had just taken the first step on a journey that would transform not just his own understanding of his capabilities, but the entire landscape of popular music. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over Stone Town, Zanzibar, in 1963, casting long shadows across the coral stone buildings where 16-year-old Farrokh Bulsara walked with measured steps toward what would become the most defining moment of his young life. His heart hammered against his ribs as he approached the modest office building, clutching a piece of paper with an address scrawled in his father's careful handwriting. This was it, his chance to audition for the local music group that had been making waves across the island. But Farrokh carried a secret burden, one that had followed him through the corridors of boarding school and haunted every mirror he passed. His teeth protruded prominently, creating what others called an unsightly overbite that seemed to push his upper lip forward in a permanent, awkward smile. As he climbed the narrow stairs, the sound of his footsteps echoed like a countdown to judgment. The young man had spent countless nights lying awake in his dormitory bed at Panchgani boarding school, running his tongue across those extra incisors that crowded his mouth, wondering if his dreams of musical stardom would forever remain just that, dreams. His classmates had been merciless in their teasing, calling him names that cut deeper than any blade. But music had always been his sanctuary. When he sat at the piano or picked up a guitar, when he lost himself in the soaring melodies of his favourite records, the world seemed to shift into perfect harmony, and his perceived flaws melted away into insignificance. The door opened before he could knock, and a stern-faced man in his 50s gestured him inside. The room was sparse, containing only a battered upright piano, 2 wooden chairs, and walls lined with faded photographs of local performers. The air hung thick with the scent of cigarettes and unfulfilled dreams. This was it, his moment to prove that the fire burning in his chest could translate into something the world would want to hear. Farrokh had practiced for weeks, choosing songs that would showcase the unusual range of his voice, pieces that would demonstrate the power that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within his chest cavity. But as he opened his mouth to introduce himself, the man's eyes immediately focused on his teeth with an expression of barely concealed disgust. Before Farrokh could utter a single note, before he could demonstrate the hours of preparation that had brought him to this moment, the executive leaned back in his chair and delivered a verdict that would have crushed a lesser spirit. Those protruding teeth, he declared with casual cruelty, would prevent him from ever making it as a professional singer. The music industry, he explained with the authority of someone who had clearly made such pronouncements before, demanded conventional beauty, and Farrokh's dental situation was simply too distracting for audiences to overlook. The words hit like physical blows, each syllable designed to extinguish the flame of ambition that had sustained him through years of boarding school loneliness and family expectations. The man suggested, with what he probably considered kindness, that Farrokh should consider dental surgery to correct his bite before pursuing any serious musical aspirations. "Fix the teeth," he said, "and perhaps there might be a future in music." Continue as he was, and disappointment would be his only companion. The message was clear and devastating. His natural appearance was incompatible with his deepest dreams. But something extraordinary happened in that moment of potential defeat. Instead of crumbling under the weight of rejection, instead of accepting the narrow definition of what a performer should look like, Farrokh felt something crystallize within his spirit. The same defiant energy that had carried him through years of being different, of standing out in crowds for all the wrong reasons, suddenly transformed into a weapon of pure determination. He looked at the man who had just attempted to destroy his future and made a decision that would ultimately reshape the landscape of popular music forever. He would not fix his teeth. He would not conform to someone else's vision of acceptability. Instead, he would find a way to make his supposed flaw into his greatest strength. Walking out of that office, Farrokh felt the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders, but also something else. A burning resolve that seemed to light up his entire being. The rejection stung, certainly, but it also ignited a fierce curiosity about what might be possible if he approached his perceived disadvantage from an entirely different angle. That evening, alone in his room, he stood before his mirror and studied his reflection with new eyes. What if those protruding teeth weren't a barrier to overcome, but rather a unique instrument waiting to be mastered? What if the very thing that made him different could become the source of a sound unlike anything the world had ever heard? The next morning found him seeking out Mrs. Sarah Blackwood, a retired opera singer who had moved to Zanzibar after decades performing in London's most prestigious venues. Her reputation as a vocal coach was legendary among the island's musical community, and her standards were notoriously high. Most students left her studio either transformed or thoroughly discouraged, with very little middle ground between triumph and defeat. When Farrokh appeared at her door, stammering through an explanation of his situation and his unconventional request for guidance, she studied him with the penetrating gaze of someone who had spent a lifetime evaluating musical potential. Mrs. Blackwood listened to his story without interruption, her weathered hands folded in her lap as he described the previous day's humiliation and his stubborn refusal to submit to corrective surgery. When he finished speaking, she was quiet for a long moment, considering not just his words, but the determination that radiated from his slight frame. Finally, she spoke with the measured authority of someone who understood both the cruelty and the unexpected gifts that the music world could offer. She had seen many students over the years, she told him, but few who possessed the courage to turn their supposed weaknesses into sources of strength. She would work with him, she decided, but only if he was prepared to approach his voice as a scientist, would approach an unexplored territory. Under Mrs. Blackwood's guidance, Farrokh began a journey of vocal discovery that would consume the next several months of his life. She had him place his hands on his throat and chest as he sang, teaching him to feel the vibrations and resonance created by his unique oral structure. Those extra teeth, she explained, created additional spaces for air to move and sound to resonate, potentially giving him access to tonal qualities that conventional singers could never achieve. But accessing this potential would require developing techniques that had never been taught in any traditional vocal method, approaches that would work specifically with his anatomy rather than against it. The practice sessions were grueling and often frustrating. Mrs. Blackwood had him experiment with different breathing patterns, teaching him to use his diaphragm in ways that would maximize the resonant potential of his distinctive mouth shape. She showed him how to position his tongue and control his airflow to create sounds that seemed to emerge from multiple chambers within his throat and chest. Some days, progress seemed impossible, and Farrokh would leave her studio feeling more confused and defeated than when he had arrived. But slowly, incrementally, something began to emerge from these unconventional exercises, a voice unlike anything either of them had expected. After months of rigorous practice, months of experimenting with techniques that pushed the boundaries of conventional vocal training, the moment arrived for Farrokh to test his transformed abilities before an audience. The school's annual concert provided the perfect opportunity, a stage where he could reveal what he had discovered about his own potential without the pressure of professional judgment. As he prepared for his performance, selecting a song that would showcase the remarkable range he had been developing, Farrokh felt a mixture of anticipation and terror that seemed to electrify every nerve in his body. The evening of the concert arrived with a tropical humidity that made everything feel thick and dreamlike. Students, teachers, and parents filled the modest auditorium, creating a buzz of conversation and expectation that seemed to vibrate through the warm air. Farrokh stood backstage, his heart pounding with such intensity that he worried it might be audible to the audience. This was more than just a performance. It was a test of everything he had learned about himself, about the power of refusing to accept limitations imposed by others. When his name was announced, he walked onto the stage with steady steps, his distinctive smile no longer a source of shame, but a badge of defiant authenticity. The audience fell quiet, some no doubt noticing his unusual appearance and perhaps wondering what they were about to witness. Farrokh positioned himself at the microphone, took a deep breath that seemed to draw air from the very depths of his being, and opened his mouth to sing. What emerged was nothing short of miraculous. His voice soared across 4 full octaves with a richness and power that seemed to fill every corner of the auditorium, every space between the listeners and their own understanding of what a human voice could achieve. The same teeth that had been proclaimed a barrier to his dreams now created a resonant cavity that amplified his natural gift into something transcendent. The audience sat in stunned silence as Farrokh's voice moved from the deepest bass notes to soaring soprano heights, each transition seamless and powerful, each note carrying an emotional weight that seemed to touch something primal in. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in that cramped recording studio in Stonetown, casting harsh shadows across 17-year-old Farrokh Bulsara's face as he stood before the microphone. His heart hammered against his ribs, palms slick with nervous sweat, as the record executive leaned back in his chair with the casual cruelty of someone who held dreams in his hands like fragile glass. The man's eyes swept over Farrokh's appearance with clinical detachment, lingering on the prominent front teeth that pushed slightly forward, creating what others called an overbite, but what Farrokh had learned to live with as simply part of who he was. Then came the words that would echo through rock history, though neither man knew it then. "With those teeth, son, you'll never make it as a singer. No one wants to hear someone who looks like that." The executive's dismissal cut through the humid Zanzibar air like a blade. But something extraordinary happened in that moment of rejection. Instead of crumbling, instead of accepting defeat, Farrokh Bulsara felt something ignite within him. A defiant fire that would burn brighter than anyone could imagine. The rejection stung, certainly, but it also awakened something profound in the young man who had already survived the upheaval of leaving his beloved India, who had weathered the storms of displacement and cultural adaptation. Born in Stonetown to Parsi parents, who had instilled in him both discipline and dreams, Farrokh carried within him the resilience of generations who had learned to thrive wherever life planted them. His father, Bommy, worked as a cashier at the British Colonial Office, a steady man who valued education and hard work, while his mother, Jer, filled their home with music and laughter, encouraging her son's artistic inclinations even when others questioned their practicality. The Bulsara household was one where Persian traditions blended seamlessly with British colonial influences and the vibrant African culture that surrounded them, creating a unique tapestry of identity that would later inform Freddie's revolutionary approach to music and performance. Those teeth that the executive had so dismissively criticized were not merely a cosmetic concern, they were the result of 4 extra incisors that had crowded his mouth since childhood. His parents had offered to pay for dental work, suggesting that orthodontics might ease his path through life. But even as a teenager, Farrokh possessed an intuitive understanding that his perceived flaws might actually be his greatest assets. He had noticed how his unusual dental structure affected the resonance of his voice, how it created unique pockets of air that seemed to give his singing a distinctive quality that he couldn't quite explain, but could definitely feel. When he sang in the privacy of his room, experimenting with scales and melodies, he could sense that his voice carried a power and range that surprised even him. The space created by those extra teeth seemed to act like a natural amplifier, allowing him to project sound in ways that felt almost supernatural. The morning after that devastating meeting with the record executive, Farrokh made a decision that would alter the trajectory of popular music forever. Rather than retreat into self-doubt or rush to fix what others saw as a flaw, he sought out Geeta Chokshi, a respected vocal coach who had worked with several successful artists in the region. When he knocked on her door, his determination was palpable, his young face set with a resolve that impressed the experienced teacher immediately. He explained what had happened, how he had been dismissed because of his appearance, but instead of asking her to help him sing around his supposed limitation, he asked her to help him sing because of it. This distinction was crucial, representing a fundamental shift in perspective that would define not just his approach to music, but his entire philosophy of self-acceptance and artistic authenticity. Geeta Chokshi recognized something special in the young man from the moment he opened his mouth to sing. His range was extraordinary, spanning nearly 4 octaves, with a flexibility and power that defied conventional explanation. Together, they began to explore how his unique oral structure contributed to this remarkable ability. The extra space in his mouth allowed for greater resonance in the lower registers while still maintaining clarity in the higher notes. His overbite, rather than hindering his articulation, actually helped him create the distinctive pronunciation that would later become one of his most recognizable characteristics as a performer. They worked tirelessly on breathing techniques that would maximize the natural advantages his anatomy provided, developing exercises that strengthened his already impressive vocal cords, while teaching him to use every aspect of his physical structure as an instrument. Week after week, month after month, Farrokh dedicated himself to his vocal training with an intensity that amazed his teacher. He practiced scales that pushed the boundaries of what most singers could achieve, worked on breath control exercises that allowed him to sustain notes that seemed to go on forever, and developed a stage presence that transformed his perceived physical shortcomings into commanding assets. Geeta taught him that great performers don't hide their uniqueness, they celebrate it, and Farrokh absorbed this lesson with the fervor of someone who had found his life's purpose. His voice began to develop qualities that were entirely his own, a rich baritone that could soar into operatic heights or growl with rock and roll grit, all while maintaining perfect pitch and emotional authenticity. The transformation was not merely technical, but deeply psychological. Each lesson built his confidence. Each breakthrough reinforced his growing belief that what made him different was precisely what would make him great. He began to understand that his rejection by that record executive was not a career-ending setback, but a career-defining moment of liberation. No longer would he try to fit into someone else's mold of what a singer should look like or sound like. Instead, he would create his own template, one that celebrated individuality over conformity, authenticity over commercial acceptability. This realization was revolutionary in its implications, not just for his personal development, but for the entire landscape of popular music that was desperately ready for someone willing to shatter conventional boundaries. His first public performance after months of intensive training took place at a local cultural festival, where he had managed to secure a brief slot through a family connection. The audience was small but diverse, representing the multicultural fabric of Zanzibar itself. As he stepped onto the makeshift stage, Farrokh felt a transformation occurring within him. This was no longer the uncertain teenager who had been dismissed by that record executive. This was someone who had discovered his power, who understood that his uniqueness was not a burden to overcome, but a gift to unleash upon the world. When he opened his mouth and began to sing, the reaction was immediate and electric. His voice filled the space with a richness and range that left the audience stunned into silence, then erupting into applause that seemed to go on forever. That performance marked the moment when Farrokh Bulsara began his metamorphosis into Freddie Mercury. He realized that night that his voice was not just an instrument, but a weapon against mediocrity, a force that could move people in ways that conventional prettiness never could. The very characteristics that others had criticized became the foundation of his artistic identity. His prominent teeth, which had once been a source of insecurity, now felt like part of his natural stage persona. His overbite, which the record executive had seen as a career killer, now seemed like the perfect complement to a voice that defied categorization. He was beginning to understand that true artistry comes not from perfection, but from the courage to be gloriously, unapologetically imperfect. News of the remarkable young singer spread through Zanzibar's tight-knit music community like wildfire. Musicians who had heard him perform began seeking him out, curious about the teenager with the extraordinary voice and the refusal to conform to industry standards. Record producers who had initially dismissed him started making inquiries, suddenly interested in the artist they had previously overlooked. But perhaps most tellingly, the very executive who had so brutally rejected him just months earlier reached out through intermediaries, requesting a second audition and hinting at potential recording opportunities. The irony was not lost on Farrokh, who had spent those intervening months not changing himself to meet industry expectations, but developing the confidence to exceed them entirely. When the invitation for that second audition arrived, Farrokh faced a decision that would define not just his career, but his character. He could have accepted, could have walked back into that same studio and proven the executive wrong through sheer vocal ability. The vindication would have been sweet, the victory complete. But something deeper had shifted within him during those months of training and self-discovery. He no longer needed validation from people who could only see potential after it had been proven rather than when it needed nurturing. His polite but firm decline of the audition became legendary in local music circles, not as an act of arrogance, but as a statement of artistic integrity that would define his approach to the music industry for the rest of his life. Instead of seeking approval from those who had failed to recognize his worth, Farrokh began building relationships with musicians and producers who shared his vision of what music could become when freed from conventional constraints. He started performing regularly at venues that appreciated artistry over appearance, building an audience that was drawn to his unique combination of technical skill and emotional authenticity. Each performance strengthened his conviction that he had made the right choice in refusing to alter his physical appearance to meet someone else's standards. His teeth, his overbite,